Welcome, everybody, to our presentation on the sinking of the nuclear submarine USS Scorpion, Theories, Evidence, History, Fact, and Fiction.
Background is I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain, 10 years active, 20 reserve. My active duty time was in nuclear submarines during the Cold War. I joined a few years after the sinking of the Scorpion, but it's still background to the submarine force when I joined. So I'm here to try to discuss what happened. I put a question mark after this so you can tell whether you think I'm on the right track or not, how convincing my presentation is. But I believe we do in fact know what sank Scorpion, and we've known for 50 years. It's really a matter of official big Navy stating yes, that we agree with that. So without ado, let me move on further. Scorpion was SSN, that's submarine nuclear power, serial number 589. She's one of 6 Skipjack class, 585 class nuclear submarines. She was lost in the North Atlantic on May 22nd, 1968. She was in transit to her home port in Norfolk, Virginia. That followed a three-month deployment to the Mediterranean at short notice. She didn't know she was getting underway until a handful of days before she was told to. And a short operation, a day and a half maybe, that much of that's still classified, versus Soviet warships in the vicinity of the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. 99 sailors were lost with the sinking of Scorpion. She left behind 64 widows, 99 fatherless children, which became 103 fatherless children over the next several months, with new births of children who would never meet their biological fathers. The definitive cause was never established, at least not formally and officially. The details remain classified to this day. Much of the details were released, in fact, in 1993 on the 25th anniversary. A lot of classified information is automatically stamped for declassification or review at 25 years. And the 25th year of the Court of Inquiry findings concluded to release much of the information in 1993. The information vacuum, some of the information is in fact still being held in confidence. But the information vacuum for 25 years and since then has fed a lot of theories, including those of conspiracies and cover-ups. Some background. The Scorpion was lost in the several years after the loss of the USS Thresher. The Thresher was the first of the Permit class or 594 class submarines, so she was more advanced than Scorpion in the Skipjack class. In fact, Thresher was a revolutionary new design, the first of what I would consider to be the modern U.S. attack nuclear submarines with modern sonar systems, a sonar sphere in the bow, torpedo in midships to allow the optimal bow location to be used for sonar, advanced quieting, and very deep diving. She was lost during post-shipyard sea trials on April 10th, 1963. The conclusions from the investigation reached were that the re-engineering hadn't kept pace with the depths that the hull was designed to reach. There were a bunch of design features and common characteristics that we still retain from World War II that really weren't viable with a ship that was able to dive deeper than 800 feet. 129 sailors were lost. This makes it the worst submarine accident in history. Kursk, for example, was only 118. The finding was that Thresher couldn't recover from what should have been a relatively minor problem and sank out to crush depth. The hull imploded, killing everybody. To talk more about it, there's controversy over what actually sank Scorpion to this day. The last transmission from Scorpion over the underwater telephone, a sonar system which carries voice, was that we're having a little problem. And the general consensus on the part of Navy today was that Scorpion sank due to massive flooding in the engine room. That shut down the reactor or caused a propulsion problem. Massive flooding on board a submarine, especially at those depths, would not have been reported as we're having a little problem. It would be said, yeah, we're in trouble here. It is concluded that Thresher and other U.S. submarines at the time had an inadequate ballasting system or deballasting system to surface the ship in the event of an emergency. The results of this investigation led to a series of subsafe or submarine safety modifications that would better allow a ship to recover from a flooding casualty. These would be backfitted to all SSNs, nuclear submarines, in the submarine force over several years. we're still working on it several years later. The construction and repair funds that had been allocated to or earmarked for building new submarines were reallocated to reinstalling the subsafe modifications on existing U.S. nuclear submarines. An ambitious Cold War new construction program was pushed back. It took the subsafe modification took up funds and the shipyard resources to implement them. Scorpion's subsafe modification was deferred. She left for Mediterranean deployment without having the subsafe modifications attached. Other maintenance was deferred. What Scorpion's normal operating depth or test depth of 700 feet was reduced to 500 feet in consideration of the fact that these modifications had not been completed. This led to a ongoing theory that one of the things or the thing that caused Scorpion's loss was a poor material condition in general. Other Cold War backdrop, other incidents. We are at this point 6 years past the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. The Arab-Israeli Six-Day War in June 1967. Both of these incidents had incentivized the Soviets to continue to build up their surface naval strength and their flexibility, including open ocean ports in the Mediterranean. So the Soviets are trying to feel their oats and experiment more with open ocean operations. The Soviets traditionally are a land power and relatively poor naval power. So they're trying to develop their capabilities now. Other background, USS Pueblo was seized by the North Koreans. She was an intelligence gathering ship operating outside North Korean waters. The North Koreans insisted she was inside North Korean waters. Of course, they're lying about that. But she was seized on January 23rd, 1968, so about four months before loss of Scorpion. There's also a Soviet submarine, a Golf II class. It's a conventionally powered diesel-electric submarine with ballistic missiles. Her number was K-29. She was lost on March 8th, 1968, so about 2.5 months before the Scorpion was lost. Talk more about the Pueblo. Pueblo was seized by the North Koreans in January of 1968. There was one American serviceman killed in action by the strafing North Korean patrol ships. 80 crew and 2 civilians were captured. So we know the North Koreans were able to seize very sensitive crypto gear. The survivors were released on December 23rd, 1968, after 7 months in captivity. They were tortured and they were forced to sign what the North Koreans called confessions, which of course were entirely fabricated. The seizure actually harmed relations between North Korea and the Soviet bloc, where a lot of conspiracy theories were that the Soviets were happy with this, that the North Koreans had done this. The Soviets exploited the crypto gear they received, but there's not a lot of basis. Perhaps the Soviets ended up with the crypto gear that the North Koreans would have had a hard time using, but there's not a lot of basis upon the fact that the seizure of Pueblo was in fact one of the roots of the loss of Scorpion, which is what one of the conspiracy theories entails. To talk about the Golf II K-129, she was lost on March 8, 1968. She was a ballistic missile submarine patrolling off Hawaii. Her likely targets were going to be installations on the Hawaiian Islands. She only has 2, I believe, the ship has 2 ballistic missiles out of the sail, and that's probably both targeted at Pearl Harbor and the related facilities. Now, we clearly knew in the aftermath of the loss of Golf, it became clear we knew better than the Soviets where she was, and where she went down. Cause of the loss has not been definitively identified, but it was probably a dual missile light-off in their launch tubes, an accident or electrical circuitry malfunction or programming malfunction that lit off both missiles. Alternatives in that loss include a missile non-nuclear explosion, collision with the U.S. submarine, and the Soviets and conspiracy theorists always blame USS Swordfish in this because Swordfish was underway and would have been somewhere in that vicinity. An internal main battery explosion, intentional or unintentional scuttling. As many as 40 of the 98 crew members were new to the boat, which suggests the possibility that there would have been an accident. The crew was inexperienced, and someone could have made a mistake that would have destroyed the submarine. This would be the kernel of conspiracy theorists regarding Scorpion. And for example, that Scorpion was destroyed by Soviet retaliation for sinking their submarine. So, in addition to all the conspiracies that the submarine that the submarine had gone rogue, and that there were other sailors on board that fought. Some sailors that were going to launch the nuclear missile to start a war. The submarine was clearly well south of where the Soviets thought she was supposed to be. 1974, there was a mostly failed attempt by the Glomar Explorer, a ship built by Howard Hughes called Project Azorian, to grab Golf 2 off of the bottom. This is where we're talking about. It's this Kamchatka Peninsula, the Ribashi Naval Base, where the Golf 2 had been based, and she's known to have been February 24th in this area. Hawaiian Islands are down here, and this is where the actual sinking took place. This is where the Soviets thought the patrol area was. Not that she was necessarily out of position; she was just a lot closer than could necessarily be explained. And this is in fact where the Soviets started some research efforts, when we ended up going straight to the sinking site because we knew exactly where she went down. Other Cold War backdrop: the Scorpion and K-129 were actually 2 of 4 submarines lost mysteriously in the first half of 1968. The Israeli submarine Dakar, which was formerly the British T-class submarine, was launched on January 25th, 1968. She wasn't found until 1999 between Cyprus and Crete. A French submarine, Minerva, was lost on January 27th, just 2 days later. She was only found a couple of years ago. The last time I gave this lecture, I had to say, we don't know where she was. But now we do. She was found in 2019, 28 miles southeast of the coast of France near Toulon. So she's 28 miles from her base, and she went down with all hands. Other Cold War background: the Tet Offensive is still ongoing in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese National Liberation Forces, Viet Cong, had kicked off the offensive on January 31st, when most of the South Vietnamese army was on leave and many U.S. forces were on stand down for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. The My Lai massacre was in March 1968, those of you interested in Cold War history. The Prague Spring, January to August 1968, Czechoslovakia was experimenting with reforms. This would cause a kink in the Soviets' armor. They considered that the Czechoslovakia to be an important member of the Warsaw Pact, as well as a buffer between them and NATO, the Soviet territory proper, NATO forces. So they couldn't have that, and they moved in with their tanks to quell the whole thing. The other submarines disappeared: Israeli Dakar. This is wreckage on the bottom, and Minerva, and other wreckage on the bottom. Okay, controversies regarding Scorpion. Scorpion was to return home at 1 p.m. on Monday, May 27th. That's observed Memorial Day. Wives are waiting on the pier, some with their children. They were told that the boat was delayed and to go home. Once they were home, they had local news, which had gotten onto the story that Scorpion was in fact being declared missing. And that's not the way that you're supposed to find out that your husband is probably dead. Many survivors never forgave the Navy for that. But they heard, the Navy's beginning a search for a missing submarine, when they were told she's delayed, go home and we'll call you. Navy held a court of inquiry. Much of the court of inquiry information is still classified testimony. Some of it is still sealed. That this fed conspiracy theories of a cover-up. Now, I'd point out that technically security classification is a form of cover-up, but you cover things up for national security purposes, not because you think it's going to embarrass you. The conspiracy theories are that some of the information would have embarrassed the Navy, and that's why it's still being withheld. Conspiracy theories also include Soviet ambush, or covering the U.S. Navy failure to fund adequate maintenance for the submarine. Rumors circulated among the submarine community and the Navy for decades that anybody who's in the military knows about how a rumor mill works, and these things just feed on for years and years and years. There are 3, quote, good books, unquote. Some people would disagree with some of these. My best resource, I strongly suggest, is Bruce Rule's book, Why the Scorpion Was Lost. It was published in 2011. Now, Bruce Rule is somewhat of a legend in the submarine force. He was head of Acoustic Analysis Division, Office of Naval Intelligence. I don't remember if I ever met him. I certainly heard the name all my time on active duty and in the reserves. So he's highly respected as an acoustic analyst. And his book consists of actually a compilation of 6 open letters and a timeline. And the open letters were written to the Chief of Naval Operations, Commander Submarine Forces Atlantic and the Commander of Office of Naval Intelligence, with his findings and analysis. He retired and did pro bono analysis on what was available. Acoustic information came out with much better information, better theories than were produced in 1968 to 1970. So his book has me convinced, spoiler alert here, has me convinced that the loss of Scorpion was due to a hydrogen explosion in two cells of the main storage battery. We'll go into further how that mechanism took place and the things that fed into it. His intent, Bruce Rule's intent, was to try to bring some closure to the survivors, and it's a strong argument. He tries to make the admirals say, we need to reinvestigate or announce our findings with regard to what took Scorpion down for the benefit of the wives and the surviving wives and their children. Now, Ed Offley's book, Scorpion Down, published in 2007, a lot of people would criticize me for this because it is a very strong conspiracy theory book. Now, Ed Offley is a career journalist. He was enlisted Navy man in Riverine Patrol in Vietnam. So he rode the fast boats. His military experience was as a junior enlisted in a wartime zone in a war that was not very popular among people. But he'd been covering military affairs for decades. He has an excellent book called Turning the Tide, which is about the springtime campaign, North Atlantic campaign, British, Canadians, U.S. versus U-boats. That goes a long way toward trying to explain how the Battle of the North Atlantic was won. And as far as this book goes, it's 2/3 of an excellent book. And specifically, the first 2/3 of it are the best timeline and explanation I could see of what Scorpion was, what she was doing during the Cold War, and what the nature and timeline of her disappearance and the search were. But 2/3 of the way in, at the end of chapter 5, I think it is, he writes, yes, and that's the official history, but it was all a lie. And then he spends the rest of the third of the book going into the conspiracy theory that the Soviets sank the Scorpion and we knew all about it. Anyway, moving on, Stephen Johnson, I recommend his book Silent Steel, published in 2006. He's also a career journalist. He does a good explanation of the material deficiencies that Scorpion saw, and the fact that she wasn't necessarily really ready for a long duration operation. I think she was, just from what I've seen, what I've heard. Although there are definitely problems with it. There's problems with everything, anything as large and complex as a nuclear submarine. But he also does a very good look at who the sailors were, who their survivors are, naming people, talking about who they are, and puts a face to it. To get back to the Skipjack class, Scorpion was a Skipjack class. It's a hybrid between, I would consider it as a naval designer, a hybrid between the World War II fleet submarines and the modern nuclear submarines. The World War II submarines of the Gato, Balo, and Tench classes led to the Guppy or Greater Undersea Propulsion series of backfits. We had, at the closure of World War II, we had a large number of these relatively, for their time, sophisticated diesel-electric submarines, but they were built for open ocean warfare against convoys and other fleets. And they weren't built for anti-submarine warfare, and our challenge from the Soviets was going to be submarines. So we created the Greater Undersea Propulsion Program to turn them from fleet submarines for attacking convoys into advance into first series of hunter killer submarines, using a lot of advances from the German Type 21 class U-boats that we were able to capture at the end of World War II. The Tang next class was the Tang class. That was the Guppy design from the keel up. And the Tang class actually led to the Nautilus, Seawolf, and Skate class nuclear submarine designs. Still, if you look at the Type 21 German U-boat, and I'll show some pictures later, and look at the Nautilus, our first nuclear submarine, you see the same essential hull design. We stole it from the Germans, and we retained it, and it was still okay. But the trouble is the Type 21 hull design starts to nose down at over 20 knots. Type 21 never had to worry about that. Her underwater speed is about 18. So, but once we start getting to a ship called Nautilus that can do 24 to 26 knots, nosing down with a relatively limited test depth at 20 knots is not the thing you want to do. So we've had to start to go back a few decades and start to look at these teardrop shaped designs. We built the Albacore as a test submarine, which is a conventional diesel-electric submarine with a teardrop hull, and those led to the Barbell conventional and Skipjack class nuclear designs. We see Scorpion here. To go back to some of what I was saying, this is the Gato class, 77 Gatos built in 1941, the Guppy conversions by 1948. And we see largely the displacement increased a little bit surface, not much submerged, but it's a much larger ship, 312 feet to 552 than the Type 21. They're built for different purposes, and the Gatos were built to operate in the Pacific that was twice as large as the Atlantic, after all. Well, we see mostly you see a very large difference in the underwater speed of 9 knots going to 16 with the additional capacity and additional more powerful electric motors that the Guppy class entailed bringing on board. And we see also that this was the first U-boat that actually went faster submerged than on the surface. What else is rare? The range submerged is dramatically increased because being built as a hunter killer, you want this ship to be able to spend a lot of time submerged. 6 bow tubes, but such the same thing. Okay. And here we see this is a Gato class, and this is Dorado. We see the Rosie the Riveters finishing her up in port. This is a Type 21 U-boat, and we can see what they turned this into by stripping the hull to increase their submerged speed. These fairings protect sonar systems, passive sonar systems, again to convert the ship from a convoy attack ship to an anti-submarine warfare ship. So it's much more streamlined hull, much faster, and we can see some of the similarities. Your clipper bow as designed, and as she came out of modification, she has this flat bow. And again, this is going back to the turn of the century, the original French designs that started the whole thing through the German U-1s and UB types, going on to the German cruiser submarines at the end of World War I that went on to make the Japanese I boats and our fleet boats, U.S. fleet boats, onto the Guppies. The Type 21 injected technology that fed the Guppies. And that then went on to Tang, Nautilus, Scorpion, and then Thresher. So more things about Skipjack. She had the teardrop hull, which is probably the most hydrodynamic design of anything, with the possible exception of the Soviet Alpha class. She had an S5W reactor plant, S meaning submarine, W is a Westinghouse design, 5 is a serial number for the Westinghouse submarine designs. That's probably the most successful and probably the most produced reactor plant design in all of history, in commercial or military. With her power, her size, her shape, her configuration, she could do 37 knots with a 7-bladed screw. If you want to put on a 5-blade screw, I wouldn't be surprised if she could exceed 40. I don't think they ever did that. 7-bladed screw is quieter, and if she's supposed to be dealing with other submarines and acting as a hunter killer, you want her to be quiet. Other features, these are the modern features. The old features, though, she's still using a last generation sonar suite, which is a modification and upgrade to the Type 21 sonar systems. She's a bank of 6 21-inch torpedo tubes forward in a separate torpedo room, which is essentially the 4-battery World War II fleet boat. And she has hard-mounted main engines, which would make her noisy, especially at any type of serious speed. In many ways, she's the ultimate incarnation of the World War II fleet submarine, while the next class, the Thresher Permit class, would be a revolutionary improvement on them. Her weapons mix includes the Mark 37 acoustic ASW homing torpedo. This is one of our first homing torpedoes. She's got a sonar system to home on a target that it finds. It's wire guided, so she can be steered after launch. Battery powered. Scorpion also would carry the Mark 14 straight running ASUW torpedo, anti-surface torpedo, staple of our submarine force in World War II. That's still around now because she has a much larger warhead. If you want to shoot at anything big, you have to use a whole lot of Mark 37s or 1 or 2 Mark 14s. So she was still in the service at this point. And Scorpion would also carry the Mark 45 nuclear torpedo, nuclear warhead torpedo, wire guided and wire detonated, 5 to 8 nautical mile range, a modestly sized warhead. After all, it's not intended to be a suicide weapon. So if we move forward to 1968, in the late winter, Scorpion has gotten one of the cheapest and shortest submarine overhauls in recent years. Again, as I mentioned, maintenance was deferred for cost and shipyard availability while we backfit subsafe modifications. People were being concerned with how much the shipyard modifications were costing, the shipyard overhauls were costing, and a new design to try to do smaller maintenance periods in shipyards and more overhaul or more availability periods at depots, that's for in Groton in Norfolk, for example, to see if that would work. After the fact that she had a cheap and short overhaul, also fit conspiracy theories that the ship was not ready for deployment in the material condition. Her 700-foot design depth, where she was allowed to operate typically, was restricted to 500 feet. With respect to the fact that the subsafe modifications had been deferred, and she was further restricted to 300 feet because she had a persistent shaft seal leak. The shaft goes through the aft section, and there's a shaft seal system to keep water from backfilling. That means seawater was coming in slowly through around the shaft, and that was one of the things that they were having a hard time fixing and keeping fixed. So that she was being restricted to 300 feet. The ship that should have been able to go to 700 feet. Anyway, if she's operating at high speed at 300 feet, that makes her even noisier. But anyway, despite all these things, insofar as her capabilities as a hunter-killer submarine go, she would be the best ship in the world after the Sturgeons and Thresher classes and the newer Polaris boats. So she was a good anti-submarine warfare ship, and she was still being used in that role. Let's talk about her Mediterranean deployment. She left in early February 1968. She wasn't planning on going to the Mediterranean. She was planning on spending a few more months in port before another deployment. But she was sent to the Mediterranean on short notice stand-in for the USS Seawolf, which had run aground as part of a particularly poorly designed exercise. This gave her reduced preparation and maintenance time. Many visitors to the ship and during this workup period reported that morale seemed low. The Mediterranean was not what the crew was experienced with. A lot of ships go to the Mediterranean routinely. We had a NATO obligation to have a certain number of submarines in the Mediterranean. And when Seawolf ran aground, Scorpion was tapped as the next available boat. Scorpion made a port call in Rota, Spain, May 16th, and transferred 2 personnel on board, the last 2 sailors to leave. Very lucky sailors to get off the ship. We have here a picture of Scorpion coming alongside USS Tallahatchie County in Naples in April 1968. That's, if you can see the background I have, my green screen, that is Scorpion alongside the Tallahatchie County. One of the last pictures of her taken. So let's talk about the Canary Islands operation. The Soviets had sent a small surface group associated with the deployment of an Echo 2 class guided missile submarine that had been operating in the Mediterranean, and now she's operating in the Eastern Atlantic in the vicinity of the Canary Islands. And we were interested in seeing what they were doing down there. In particular, an operating location from there would permit Echo 2 to be in a position to close an attack either transatlantic convoys or U.S. carrier battle groups in the event of war. So Scorpion was sent to, quote, take a look, unquote. There was Admiral Shea, who was commander of submarine forces at the time, recollection after the fact on the way home. Now, submarines go to a long extent to not discuss submarine operations, and the details of what Scorpion did and what she did when monitoring Soviet operations in that vicinity are part of the things that are still classified. The closed court of inquiry. The Court of Inquiry had closed sessions to discuss the nature of the operations, and they went into detail what Scorpion did with those Soviet groups. But that would delay her return by a few days. She was supposed to get back on Friday before the long Memorial Day weekend, and instead was pushed back to Memorial Day itself, May 27th. You can bet that it didn't make a lot of the crew very happy. Scorpion's final message transmitted just after midnight on Wednesday, that would be Greenwich time, Wednesday, May 22nd. She took 3.5 hours broadcasting this. This was relayed through a U.S. communication station in Greece. High frequency radio did things like that. You're trying to bounce your signal off the thermal layer in the upper atmosphere, and who you could actually talk to and who you can't is sometimes very hard to predict, and sometimes you just pass the message on to somebody who had a better chance of relaying it to where you needed to go. So they talked for 3.5 hours to Greece. The SITREP, the Court of Inquiry, reported that it was a SITREP or situation report that Scorpion sent. There's controversy over that. It doesn't take you 3.5 hours unless the radio conditions are very, very poor to send your course speed and your ETA in Norfolk. Most likely, this 3.5 hour comms period included a synopsis of their Canary Islands operation, and the fact that it was against the Soviets was one of the reasons why it has not been made official. MCON or mission control or not MCON or mission control. Scorpion was generally under mission control conditions, but once she departed the area of Soviet naval operations, it would be up to the crew to decide, captain's discretion, whether or not to break the mission control and start communicating. At the meantime, messages could be sent to Scorpion in the blind, and there were various systems in place to ensure that it was likely she was going to get that. But the operation order called for Scorpion to stay on a mission control until at least May 21st, let's say. More controversy built up over this, conspiracy theories, that the squadron had in fact sent Scorpion messages, and the fact that Scorpion didn't respond to those messages fed conspiracy theorists to say, okay, well, the Navy knew that Scorpion was lost long before the announcement that Scorpion was missing on Monday, 27th. The fact of the matter is the ship had discretion on whether or not they would respond, and it didn't alert anybody that didn't think anything would be unusual until Scorpion would fail to report in about 1 hour before arriving at the pier at what we call Point Alpha or Chesapeake Bay Light outside of Norfolk. That's when she would have to come up and say, okay, we're due, so start arranging tugboats. So the non-arrival day, Monday, May 27th, this is observed Memorial Day. Scorpion's due to arrive at 1 p.m. It's bad weather. There's rains, heavy rains and wind on the pier, but a subset of the wives braved it and they were waiting on the pier. Now, Commander Submarine Forces Atlantic, Constable Lant, the Norfolk-based 3-star admiral, their staff would have expected Scorpion to break a mission control upon arrival at the Chesapeake Bay Light. That will be an hour out from the pier, and Scorpion needs to communicate. She would be surfaced at that point, needs to communicate to say you need to start arranging for tugs to help pull us alongside. Single screw ship with a rudder mounted in front of the screw is very, very difficult to maneuver in close quarters. It can be landed to a pier, but it's not easy. And if you mess it up, it gets really ugly and looks very ungraceful very fast. So you get tugboats ready when you want to get a nuclear submarine tied up to a pier. But Constable Lant was alert that they should have been hearing from Norfolk, and they didn't. So they began to get apprehensive, probably again about noon on Monday. But there's still dozens of explanations for Scorpion not checking in that did not involve the submarine sinking with all hands. So by the arrival time, they're on the phone to the submarine squadron, and they're sending out messages to Scorpion asking for a situation for where are you, what are you doing? The Constable Lant staff recognized something was wrong, and they contact their boss. We'll talk about their boss in a second. But the wives were told it was delayed, that there was a, quote, delay, unquote, and they were told to go home. This is the boss. This is Vice Admiral Arnold Shade. He's Commander Submarine Forces Atlantic, and he's a U.S. Naval Academy graduate in 1933. In terms of the history of submarine warfare, he's best known as being the executive officer of USS Growler on the night of 6 to 7 February 1943. You've probably seen it acted out in any number of movies, but there was a case where the Growler had in fact attacked a Japanese convoy on the surface. Were moving at night, were moving away at speed, and they came under fire. It was believed that Howard Gilmore, the commanding officer, realized that he was mortally wounded, and he ordered from the bridge, he ordered to take her down after everyone else was down, and thus gave up his life to get the submarine submerged 30 seconds to a minute out of enemy fire faster than they would have if they tried to get him below decks. He received the posthumous Medal of Honor for that. We saw this event played out with names and dates changed to protect the innocent. We saw it in the movie Operation Pacific. It was played out in Herman Walk's book, Born Remembrance, and in the miniseries. Now, Shade, in Operation Pacific, John Wayne played the role of the executive officer that took the ship down and completed the patrol. So Arnold Shade was, in fact, that executive officer. Getting played by John Wayne in a major movie is probably something that would excite you, although I'm sure he wished his captain hadn't been killed. But anyway, that's a brief World War II story I wanted to catch you up on, to tell you who Shade is. 25 years later, Shade is now a vice admiral. He's one of the two most important, most senior submarine-specific officer posts in the Navy. You know, the submarine officer might be a four-star admiral as the chief of naval operations, but as far as a submarine billet, there's a three-star admiral who is commander of submarine forces Atlantic and Norfolk, and a three-star admiral who is the deputy chief of naval operations for submarine warfare in the Pentagon. And it goes back and forth every few years over which one is considered to be the senior authority on submarine warfare. It has nothing to do with their time and rank. It has to do with their position. And typically, I track it with whatever party is in office, in charge in the Oval Office. The Republicans like to push the power and authority out to forward area commanders. So Capt is usually the senior submarine authority in Norfolk during Republican administrations. Democrats like to pull power and authority back into the Beltway. So the deputy commander, chief of naval operations for submarine warfare usually ends up being considered the senior submariner when there's a Democrat in the Oval Office. Shifts back and forth. And in fact, one of the reasons why Bruce Rule's letters were some written to CNO and some written to the Capt were because of a shift. Anyway, at sea, Shade is at sea in Narragansett Bay on USS Fargo. He's riding the submarine. He will do that. He will ride submarines many times a year. And he's off Groton, Connecticut, in the Narragansett Bay op areas on Monday. He gets information that Scorpion has reported in when she was expected at Point Alpha off Virginia Beach. And he declares a submiss or missing submarine alert at 2:15. A missing submarine is not anything unheard of. We've lost many submarines up to that point, and some usually every 10, 15 years goes by between when we lose a submarine at sea. So there's an event submiss, and there are things people are expected to do when that is declared. Now, there's controversy over this. Ed Offley wrote in his book that Shade told him 15 years later in a phone call that Shade was in fact off Norfolk on USS Ray when he was informed of concerns about Scorpion on May 24th. That would have, of course, been on Friday, and well before anyone in the Navy officially says they knew there was any problem with Scorpion. So days before the failure to arrive. Now, Offley presents this as evidence that the Navy knew Scorpion was lost long before she failed to arrive. I think it was just at that point an aging man, Shade, talking about something that happened 15 years earlier, and he's a little bit confused. He's at this point 71, I think. So Shade orders a search to begin. It includes ordering Fargo south, and the submarine force begins with submarine force assets in the wider Navy, supplements with additional ships and becomes the largest search in U.S. Navy history. It eclipsed the previous record held for the 1930s with the search for Amelia Earhart. The hope was that Scorpion was rolling around on the surface, bobbing with propulsion and communications problems, or that she was at worst at the bottom in salvageable waters with the hull intact and the crew potentially alive and rescued. Now, in the latter case, we'd had a lot of crews trapped in the bottom in submarines. History shows that something would have likely killed them in 2 to 4 days. So they didn't have a lot of time to waste. Multiple ships can decide by search southwest along the expected approaches with their radars looking for Scorpion on the surface with communications difficulties. Underwater search emphasized on shallow waters where she could have possibly bottomed and survived. Submarine typically operates about 1 or 2% of her time in waters at which she could, that were shallow enough to survive bottoming. Scorpion is finally declared lost on June 5th at 8 p.m. Greenwich time. The searchers completed their search from Norfolk to Scorpion's last reported position, turned up nothing. Search turned from at that point from rescue to investigation. It's important to the Navy, and again, they'd done this before, to declare a ship lost because wives need to get paid and to start to access survivors' benefits is necessary to make that declaration. Now, the U.S. media largely lost this. It got pushed to the back pages because Bobby Kennedy John F. Kennedy's brother. And at that point, a leading presidential candidate was shot that day in the Ambassador Hotel early that morning, and he died the next morning. So a lot of this got pushed off. At that point, I was alive. I was in elementary school, and I was following the fact that, yes, we're missing a nuclear submarine. We don't know what happened to it. Okay, catastrophic acoustic event. On a submiss declaration, calls went out to all Atlantic listening stations, acoustic listening stations, sonar stations on the bottom, to study the records back to May 22nd, the last time that Scorpion had been heard from. SOSUS is a sonar underwater surveillance system. These stations would be most likely to have detected something. In 1968, the existence of SOSUS itself was highly classified. Today it's of course been released, and these stations have been decommissioned. But Scorpion sank at the east of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, blocking sound from the SOSUS station, so they didn't hear much. There was a monitoring station off the Canary Islands that had detected a suggestive series of events they found just before 1900, that's 7 p.m. Zulu is Greenwich time, on May 22nd. Now they didn't know they didn't recognize it for what it was. They had no idea to start saying alarms that something just sank. They just heard something, and going back after the submiss, they went back and said, that's suggestive. Now, these were monitoring stations they're built for the space program, for NASA. They were meant to record crashes, boosters landing in the water where they landed and when. The stations themselves were not directional, but there were two displaced hydrophones, which were labeled hydrophone A and hydrophone D, that could be used with the time distance of arrival when the sound reached A and when it reached D to determine a general direction. And that direction was consistent with Scorpion's planned track, where Scorpion would likely have been. So it was realized that, yes, Scorpion's probably there. A second monitoring station off Nova Scotia had detected some of the major acoustic transients as well. And using both of them together, they were able to kind of lock in where Scorpion was. This is a blow up of a section of a SOSUS print, of the Canary Islands printout, rather. What happens is you have a stylus go across, and 1960s technology is actually burning the paper, and it goes a half an hour, runs back to the start, another half hour, and it's marked on operator mark 1600, 1700, 1800, etc. And here we have, and these are tick marks annotating 1 minute. And we have this major acoustic event. This is actually starts here, so that it's in fact a huge spike in the noise. The numbers put in 1, 2, 3, 4, if you can see that, are actually Bruce Rule's annotation after the fact. And they studied this information. This is out of his book. They studied this information and came up with a pretty good explanation as to what each of these events are in terms of what was collapsing inside the hull of the Scorpion that would have made an event that size. This is how it looks. Scorpion, a series of seamounts that would have interfered with some of the noise that would have reached the La Palma hydrophone A. Hydrophone D would be out here somewhere, and this is where Scorpion, in fact, ended up. Together, the two stations, Nova Scotia and the Canary Islands, locked down the resting place of Scorpion within about a 12 by 12 nautical mile box. After several iterations and the calibration of the explosive charge, we'll talk about that, the final position accuracy was determined to be much better, and they finally got to a position within a few hundred yards of where Scorpion ended up, but they wouldn't know that for about 4 months, that they were as accurate as they were. This is where, again, Canary Islands. This is where she stopped in Rota, gone to the Canary Islands. This is where the sinking was, and her track home. The breaking up noises were picked up at several monitoring stations. There's a court of inquiry finding was that the location where Scorpion went down was over 200 miles from any known Soviet vessel, including any Soviet platform. Compass Island, USS Compass Island was an auxiliary with a very good navigational system and bottom sounding system. Her job was to map the bottom for various reasons that were important to the submarine force. So she's attached to the submarine force, and she was scrambled out of port in Brooklyn in the early evening hours of Memorial Day, hours after the submiss. As a submarine force platform, she was scrambled, she'd gotten underway, and she's a good ship to go out there and look for something with sonar on the bottom. She left so fast that 40 sailors were left on the pier. They didn't get there back in time. They weren't supposed to get underway, and they couldn't respond to the emergency recall. She ends up dropping in the vicinity of this 12 by 12 box a series of explosive charges of 1.8, 20, 40, and 70-pound explosives detonated at various depths from 60 to 3,000 feet in order to try to calibrate what the Canary Islands station was seeing and what it meant. Controversy. Ed Offley claims that Scorpion Island left, the Compass Island left Friday before Scorpion failed to arrive, and that the Navy lied about the Monday sailing. He cites this as evidence that the Navy knew something was wrong before the official story says that. His claim is based on 3 petty officers who said that the ship got underway on Friday rather. The veracity is questionable, and Offley's claim would require that the Navy forge the deck log, which is a legal document, actually, absolutely, to show that the ship remained in port all weekend. Anyway, Compass Island got to the expected loss location and spent several days dropping explosive charges of various sizes at various depths. This led to the assessment that Scorpion had been at about 2,000-foot depth when this acoustic event, the major noise, occurred, and that the kinetic energy of the acoustic vent was very high, which led to a lot of people to start saying that a torpedo must have gone off. The initial scans was surprisingly accurate follow-on reevaluations based on calibration runs. This is a Compass Island run on June 9th, 1968. This is where Scorpion was. She was actually within a few tens of yards of Scorpion. Did not pick her up on sonar, but she was dropping explosive charges, and they made a first estimate of Scorpion's location, a second, a third, and a fourth, and they're narrowing in. They're actually got quite close to Scorpion's location. Compass Island passed over Scorpion on June 9th, but wouldn't realize it. It would take them 4 more months to find it. The next ship of interest is the USS Mizar. She is a research ship that tows a sled behind her, several dozen yards above the ocean surface, the ocean's bottom. She has a camera, underwater camera, powerful lights, and a magnetic anomaly detector. She towed the sled at about a half knot close to the bottom. Still, the expected detection range on Scorpion would be within a few tens of yards. So even with 12 by 12 nautical mile box, it would take Mizar over a year to find Scorpion. Mizar had found Thresher in 1964 and 1966. She located an H-bomb that had been detonated from a crashing B-52 off Spain, also on the bottom. It's rumored, again, still classified, that Mizar was getting ready to go to the Pacific in search of K-219 when she was redirected for the search for Scorpion. And when it comes to Blant, when people said Scorpion is missing, the question was, okay, where's Mizar, and how quickly can we get her out there? She starts a bottom search. Now, remember, this sled this is 1960s technology. She's not transmitting an image back to the ship. She is towing a sled with a camera that's taking pictures, and the sled needs to be pulled up, and that photography, those films developed. And then possibly weeks later, after the picture was taken, they could spot something. And in fact, she made an initial run 10 to 28 June. They saw twisted pieces of metal on the bottom with little rust, indicating that they were new to the bottom. They didn't know it, but they were in a few tens of yards of Scorpion at the time. But on returning after refurbishing the sled, putting new film in it, they could not find that metal again, and they wouldn't find Scorpion again for several months. The Navy convenes a court of inquiry to investigate Scorpion's loss. This is common. This is typical. Vice Admiral Bernard Austin chaired the court of inquiry. I met Austin. I was a midshipman in ROTC in the 1970s, and we were welcoming new prospective midshipmen. And he was, in fact, bringing one of his sons up to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute to look at that as a school his son was interested in. So I met him. He introduced himself. If I had known as a midshipman, I didn't. I noticed his background. I was impressed enough to meet a vice admiral. I would have been even more impressed. But he had convened the court of inquiry for Thresher. By the way, if his son went to Rensselaer, I didn't meet him, and he didn't join the Navy ROTC unit. But anyway, He had chaired the court of inquiry for the Thresher, and now he's being called back. He's retired. He's being called back to convene the court of inquiry for Scorpion. They conducted interviews and a records examination. Key theories that come out of this are Mark 37 torpedo hot run. It's conjectured that the warhead detonated in the torpedo room, or that they jettisoned a hot running warhead, leading to a circular run that then sank the ship. That's unlikely. We'll go into details later. Mark 38 battery electrolyte leak, which would have caused overheating, leading potentially to a fire, to a battery or warhead explosion. Catastrophic flooding, possibly shaft breaking, and loss of the submarine from a hole in the stern. A main storage battery explosion. Trash disposal unit malfunction or misuse. Trash disposal unit is essentially a vertical torpedo tube that's used to eject trash, and if it's used improperly, it could cause flooding, although there are safety features built into it, and you'd really have to mess up if you wanted to do that. But at any rate, the controversy here was that the Court of Inquiry concluded there had been a large external explosion. This information was withheld but was released in 1993, and that also fed additional conspiracy theories. They make no definitive conclusion. The court officially said no conclusion, unclassified release in January 1969. After a second convening, they got photos from Mizar and said, we still don't know what happened. Private comments by board members off the record said that they believe the Mark 37 torpedo theories were considered most likely. Now, the Navy took some action on all the possibilities that had been ruled as credible. Anything that could have taken the Scorpion down were realized to be threats. It's not important from the Navy's point of view that a single cause be determined, rather that all the identified possibilities that constituted risks needed to be allocated and mitigated. Sizable portions of the court's hearings were closed, protecting classified information. That, of course, fed conspiracy theories. Some claim this was to facilitate a cover-up. Other conspiracy theorists claim that the court was systematically lied to, and they were not party to the cover-up. Controversy also was that poor material condition existed upon deployment. She wasn't ready to get underway, and it was unsafe to put her underway. Testimony as well as records said that the ship's condition was excellent, but some of the crew had expressed other opinions. Some people said we'd heard the crew referring to her as the USS Scrap Iron, that she was in fact not ready to go. So we'll go into more details. I know I'm likely to run a little bit late here, but we'll go into some details on what some of the theories were, what's reasonable, what isn't. A hot run of a torpedo is the unintentional startup of a torpedo motor in the tube or in the torpedo room on a torpedo rack. The expected response to a hot run is to turn the ship into a circle to trigger an ACR or anti-circular run feature. This is a safety shutdown feature intended to protect the ship against the circular run of a torpedo that's gotten away. Several ships in World War II were attacked and some sunk by their own torpedoes. If you have one control fin fail in one position, if the torpedo will make a nice circle and come right back at you. The initial evidence from the acoustic data suggested that Scorpion was heading east rather than west, as would have been expected from her track back to Norfolk. Much later, it was recognized that this was not the case. The data was misinterpreted. But in 1968, the hot run theory was attractive, and that explained why Scorpion would be going east instead of west. Now, Dr. John Craven, at this point, he's a submarine scientist. He's head of the Navy's Deep Submergent Systems project. He's a strong proponent of the Mark 37 hot run theory. He's highly respected. He's the kind of guy that walks in a room, everybody shuts up and listens to what he has to say. And as soon as he says something, he would tend to bend everybody's opinions toward his own. His opinion appears to have carried inordinate weight with the Court of Inquiry. Possibly driving the court opinion had been the large external explosion theory. Again, the spike in the acoustics, but there was not evidence by the photos or any studies of the acoustics. We'll talk about the acoustics in detail in a moment. The hot run theory is that the crew decided to jettison the torpedo, stuffed it in a tube and let it go, and then it circled, acquired Scorpion, and home to detonation. A lot of problems with this theory. Too many things have to go wrong in exactly the right way. You don't reverse course in response to a hot run. You circle in response to a hot run, because you don't know what the torpedo's actual gyro setting is, and you have to do a full circle if you know you're going to trigger an anti-circular run safety feature shutdown. The explosion was too big to be explained by a Mark 37 detonation, but the court didn't realize this at the time. We didn't know that until Bruce Rule's analysis in 2007. You don't jettison a hot running torpedo Mark 37. You keep it cool and you wait for the battery to run down. It's essentially just a big electric razor. You keep it; it's going to overheat, so you need to keep it cool, but it's not going to overheat to the point where it'll detonate the warhead. So you just hose the thing down with fresh water or salt water and keep it cool, and the battery will eventually run down. Scorpion's acoustic pulse indicated deep that the acoustic transient was deep, 2,000 feet, and that's not consistent with the torpedo impact when shallow. If Scorpion wouldn't go to 2,000 feet in response to a hot run torpedo, they wouldn't expect to survive going to 2,000 feet. Notably, Camp's land and Sinkland Fleet both disagreed with this as a likely cause of the loss. Now, another theory is the Mark 37 torpedo battery. Mark 37 was a battery-powered acoustic homing torpedo optimized for anti-submarine warfare. Confusingly, the battery is known as a Mark 46 battery. Now, there's a Mark 46 torpedo that has nothing to do with the Mark 46 battery. So don't get confused by that. When we're talking about the Mark 46 battery, we're talking about the battery installed on Mark 37. It was notorious for electrolyte leakage. This battery was intended to give you a lot of power for a very short-lived period of time. Zinc, silver zinc battery, and the electrolyte was kept separate from the terminals until the time of launch. So it wasn't going to, you don't need to charge or discharge it. It wasn't going to be producing any energy until time of launch. But then the electrolyte is allowed to reach the terminals. It suddenly becomes a chemical battery. It had a history of electrolyte leakage, which caused overheating. Could cause catch fire. In theory, could cause the torpedo to explode. There's no evidence ever of a Mark 37 torpedo battery causing an explosion of Mark 37 torpedo. But it had known to generate heat that blistered the torpedo's casing. No record of damaging a submarine or causing an explosion. A battery explosion of a Mark 37 battery would not be large enough to rupture the submarine's hull, so it wouldn't have sank Scorpion. We see here a picture. This is not Scorpion's Mark 37 46 battery, but it's a Mark 37 torpedoes battery that had caught fire, and it's now on the laboratory bench being examined. Okay, the theory then would be potentially an explosion of a Mark 37 battery overheating could have caused a sympathetic detonation of the warheads. It's not considered plausible, but it would have destroyed Scorpion. Flooding and shaft problems will always have to come up. Scorpion had a shaft leak that was one of the things they had a hard time fixing and keeping fixed. Had a history of shaft vibrations. Flooding had destroyed the thresher, so it's in the forefront of the submariners' minds. Scorpion hadn't had the subsafe modifications, so she would not have the ability to recover from a flooding casualty the way a lot of submarines would have. Shaft break and ejection would have been lethal to the submarine. Now, the main storage battery explosion. Scorpion had a TLX-53 Alpha main storage battery that consists of 123 battery cells, each a lead acid battery, functionally similar to your car's battery. Each of these 123 cells weighs 1,000 pounds. This is it's 8 feet tall. It's a big battery. There's a huge amount of stored chemical potential energy in these batteries. Scorpion's battery was in fact near the end of its predicted lifespan, but experience with the type said that this type of battery lasted longer than it's designed. Scorpion's battery replacement had been deferred for 12 months. Some of the crew opined that this was unwise. But in January 1968, the month before she got underway to go to the Mediterranean, a discharge test showed that Scorpion's battery was operating at 106% capacity. So this would appear to be something that you could defer. Now, submariners understand batteries. All through World War I, World War II are all battery-powered submarines submerged. We know how to use batteries, and we know about what the troubles with batteries could be. At high rates of charge, a lead-acid storage battery can emit hydrogen gas, electrolysis of the water that's in the acid. This suggests the potential for a fire and explosion hazard. Also, at high discharge rates, cells start to reverse. Some cells are going to be stronger than other cells. So some cells start to reverse their polarity and start to actually charge instead of discharge when the battery is near depletion. So these can both produce hydrogen gas. We know that. Now, before nuclear power, there wasn't much of a potential for a hydrogen explosion when you're charging the battery. because before nuclear power, you had to be either running the diesel engine to generate the power to charge the battery with, and that produced massive ventilation throughout the ship with little potential to build up any hydrogen pockets. The hydrogen will quickly be dispersed out into the atmosphere outside the ship. Similarly, in port charging, you'll have the hatches open and all ventilation systems running if you're in port charging from shore power, and that would also create substantial ventilation, little potential for hydrogen buildup. But with nuclear power, we now have the ability to charge the battery with a minimal ventilation running on board the ship. Operational changes had not yet been made to ensure adequate ventilation during a battery charge. So the theory of this theory of a detonation would be that a hydrogen buildup in one or more storage battery cells cause the explosion. Theoretically, an explosion of hydrogen buildup in a battery cell would cause an explosion equivalent to about 20 pounds of TNT. This was initially dismissed because it would have been insufficient to breach the hull, and Scorpion was sunk after all. The theory that arose later on after the court of inquiry was that the submarine explosion would be sufficient to send a shockwave throughout the ship that would kill or incapacitate everyone on board. In theory, one of these explosions of 20 pounds of TNT in the enclosed environment that's a nuclear submarine submerged would create a 150 to 200 psi shockwave overpressure. 50 psi in theory is considered to be lethal 95% of the time. So this would have been enough to kill everyone on board if they're in the open. I don't know what the shockwave would have been back aft, because usually you'd have the doors from the forward end and the reactor and the engineering side closed, but the ventilation system would have been open throughout all. Now the submarine would be on a submarine, therefore, with everyone dead or unconscious. She's on auto course, so she's continuing basically on autopilot, heading back toward Norfolk. But she's not on auto depth control. We have an auto depth control system. We rarely use it. We keep firm control of that in the eyes of and the hands of the crewmen. With the throttles open for 18 knots, the crew unconscious, the theory was that that Scorpion drifted down to crush depth over the next 22 minutes and imploded. Now, procedures at that point in time called for rigging for collision prior to an ascent to periscope depth. This would essentially shut down ventilation ship-wide. This goes back to World War II, perhaps before. You don't necessarily entirely know for sure what's up there when you're going to a periscope depth until you get a periscope out and get a good look around. There might be somebody you're about to hit. So we rig for collision, but that also shuts ventilation systems throughout the ship. That would establish conditions allowing buildup of hydrogen pockets in battery cells, especially during a battery charge. And you might expect that Scorpion would be conducting a battery charge at 7 p.m. 1900 on a transit, because she would likely have been running drills in the morning and likely have been running drills in the afternoon. And some of these drills would have depleted the battery and called for battery charge. I typically expected to do a battery charge every evening watch when you're in transit, because you deplete it during the day running drills. For what it's worth, if this is the case, Scorpion's crew never felt a thing, not even fear. The end came instantly and without warning. I find this strangely similar to Hunley 104 years earlier, where the existing theory now was that the crew was rendered unconscious by the detonation of their explosive charge against Housatonic's hull, and they died of asphyxiation without pain or fear. Now, in June, the Court of Inquiry has now reported out. They reported their results, and they've broken up. June, July 1969, the Trieste II, this is a manned submersible, revisits the crash site of Scorpion on the bottom. They make 9 dives on Scorpion's wreckage, and they return with samples. Going back to the main storage battery theory, they returned with samples of Scorpion's battery cells. Show the top of the battery cells were charred, which indicates that there was an explosion before the ship flooded, with embedded metallic shards in them. This picture, I can't make head nor tail of it, but I included it. But this is a chunk of Scorpion's battery held by Trieste manipulator arm. Analysis revealed the potential for battery explosion. This is from Johnson's book. Now, the Navy convened a structural analysis group to try to go further into these controversies and what might drive down further into all the things that might threaten a nuclear submarine, things that they might need to do. They meet in 1960, 1970 1970 continuing analysis of Scorpion theories had many of the same personnel who provided technical inputs to the court. They had the battery samples brought back from Trieste too. The Court of Inquiry had adjourned before this. Now, the submarine structural analysis group strongly supported, they almost concluded, the battery explosion theory. Classified reports was not released until 1998. This is 5 years after the Court of Inquiry's declassification, and that's 5 years for conspiracy theories to ferment based on the large external explosion finding of the Court of Inquiry. Now, by default, the official Navy finding remains the Court of Inquiries. The structural analysis group had no mandate or authority to revise the court's conclusions. So the mystery of the loss of Scorpion was pronounced breathlessly by media personalities for years. Now, this is 20, I showed you before the La Palma printouts. This is a blow up 22 minutes before the main explosion. And this purports to show what Bruce Rule thinks are two acoustic events, 22 minutes before the loss of the main acoustic event. And of the size and duration, Rule concludes that this is consistent, in fact, with the detonation of a hydrogen pocket in a battery cell. So he thinks there were two battery cells where there's a buildup. One triggered the other about a half a second apart. Just again, from the same bearing, Canary Island Station says this is the same bearing that these events took place. They calculated to be not more than about 20 pounds of TNT equivalent. They were seen at the Canary Islands, but not the Nova Scotia Station. And this was not recognized for what it was for 40 years. Now, within a year of the court's findings, Court of Inquiry's ventilation procedures prior to this battery charge were changed to ensure there would be adequate ventilation when you start a battery charge, and that ventilation would be continued through the battery charge. There's controversy. The conspiracy theorists cite this as evidence of cover-up, that we know, in fact, what happened, but we didn't say this is because of Scorpion. We don't have to, but yes, it probably is a result of the structural analysis group and the Court of Inquiry recognizing that there need to be changes to our theories. To me, it's only responsible changing ventilation procedures during a battery charge if you recognize a threat that you hadn't recognized before. Now, this phenomenon called a bubble pulse phenomenon, characteristic of an underwater explosion. And we're talking fractions of a second here. There's actually a frequency that can be assigned to it. There's an explosion. It creates a steam gas bubble that gets collapsed by external pressure and then expands again. And this continues. And the frequency will decay away. But if you are able to hear this thing and look what you're looking at and know what you're looking at, this can be used to reliably measure the energy of the explosion and the depth at which the explosion took place. This is from, again, Bruce Rule's book, and shows multiple expansions and collapses. This was not recognized at the time. The phenomenon was known, but investigators missed it or explained it away at the time. Pulse was not recognized for what it was in 1968. But Bruce Rule, conducting analysis, said that it was missed in the 60s, which is explained away. Yeah, they calculate from this using modern techniques and the recognition of what it was, that the main acoustic event was equivalent to 13,200 pounds of TNT. That was certainly a plus and minus to that, but it's whopping big at a depth of 1,530 feet. Now they determined that that's about the energy equivalent to the hull imploding under an external pressure of 680 psi, which is what you would have at 1,530 feet, released in 10 milliseconds. Now, I believe 1,530 feet would be a more believable collapse depth than Scorpion's 2,000 feet. I don't think she could have made it to 2,000 feet, and I think it was impressive that she would have made it to 1,500. This is a ship that probably was designed to implode at 1,000 feet or a little bit beyond that. Now, the energy release that calculated here is greater than all conventional torpedoes in Scorpion's torpedo room put together. So a sympathetic detonation of all the Scorpion's warheads, aside from the 2 nuclear warheads she had on board, wouldn't have created this sizable of an explosion. So a lot of the reports of the indication of an large external explosion failed to carry don't carry water under this new theory and the new evidence. There's also a strong indication that there was no preliminary flooding here. If the hull reached 1,500 feet and collapsed and created that amount of energy, Scorpion was not sinking because she was flooding. Now, going to the conspiracy theories, the Soviet attack conspiracy theory is the one abounding. The last third of Ed Lofley's book is dedicated to advancing this. The theory is that the Soviets sank Scorpion in retaliation for the theory that the U.S. had sunk K-219 2 months earlier. The Soviets then told us, the conspiracy, those Lofley's that what they did, why they did it, so there and where they did it. And that the Navy launched a secret search of the Surgeon on Friday, 3 days before Scorpion failed to arrive in Norfolk. The official Navy narrative, then, that the Navy didn't know about Scorpion's destruction is supposed to be, therefore, a lie. The initial search was by USS Ray, USS Compass Island, and USS Josephus Daniels. Now, the Ray was awfully adds to the conspiracy theory because Admiral Shade told him he was on the Ray. Compass Island awfully puts together some evidence, dubious evidence, that Compass Island got it away on Friday, not Monday. And Josephus Daniels is underway from Charleston just because, but she actually got underway before the 22nd. So she was underway supposedly to search for a missing submarine before the submarine went missing. So none of this really holds through. The theory is that Echo 2 sank Scorpion. The Russian Soviet Echo 2 that was operating off the Canary Islands. Some people claim to have seen messages from Scorpion that Echo 2 was tracking her and that the SSN was unable to shake the SSGN. Now, that's ludicrous. The American attack submarine could do 35 knots. The Soviet guided missile submarine could do 24 with a backwind and downhill. It's like saying the Trans Am couldn't shake the VW microbus. Now, an ambush is feasible, but so many things have to go exactly the Soviet way. The end of this also ludicrous. That Echo 2 could sink Scorpion was like saying that a Spitfire and a Stuka got into a dogfight and the Stuka won. And I don't mean that the Stuka got lucky with the tail gun. I mean, she outmaneuvered, got behind the Spitfire and shot her down. So let's talk about the theories. If you give Echo a firm track for Scorpion in time for her to get on the track, now her maximum speed is about 24 knots. Scorpion's speed of advance on her homeward leg was 18 knots. She could reach 35, but she wouldn't be doing that. So Echo 2 would need the information immediately if she's going to get on the track rather than get into a tail chase with a 6-knot speed advantage against Scorpion. Scorpion would have to come through like at 18 knots, probably higher in the early evening. She probably slowed down to run her drills in the morning and afternoon, and now she has to make up time, so she might be doing 20, 23, 24. She's probably coming through at 300 feet, making a lot of noise. Okay, sure. She might not have even heard a torpedo coming in as fast and deep, shallow as she was running. But again, many things have to break exactly in the Soviet favor for this to work. Echo 2 was a first-generation Soviet nuclear submarine designed as a cruise missile launch platform. Her cruise missiles are anti-aircraft carrier. She has defensive anti-submarine capabilities, including sonar systems and torpedoes only. She's loud. She has poor sonar systems, and she is just not a match for Scorpion, which is a hunter-killer submarine. The theory is the John Walker spy ring, and John Walker was, of course, passing information, including crypto cards, to the Soviets for years. That he was active a year before he admitted he was, and that he gave the Soviets the crypto cards that the Soviets needed to get Echo to position Scorpion onto Scorpion's track. The evidence of this is that FBI agents felt that Walker was holding something back. Now, if the Soviets did use information from Walker to destroy the Scorpion, would they have told Walker about it? Would this be something he'd have to hold back? The theory then says that the Scorpions mated the crypto machines that the North Koreans got from Pueblo with the crypto cards that the Walker spy ring were passing them in a couple of months. And the Soviets then put it all together in a couple of months, including a small army of linguists and analysts for everything they'd copy to determine Scorpion's track. They'd then risk compromise of this intelligence source and method by transmitting the information to Echo 2. Once you put it on a transmitter, they're paranoid. They know that we're probably reading a lot of their mail, and you're also losing a lot of control over the sensitivity of the information by sending it to a submarine crew in the first place. Who knows who in the submarine is going to see it? Then the Echo would have to get lucky to find herself right in the path of the Scorpion. The Scorpion has a track back, but she probably has 15 miles left or right that she's authorized to operate just to give her maneuverability for her drills and to go to periscope depth. And that they would then sink the U.S. nuclear submarine based on their suspicion that we had sunk theirs a few months earlier. So her conspiracy, at off the conspiracy argument, he offers a substantial volume of outliers that contradict the official narrative. Talks about his phone interval with Vice Admiral Shade 15 years later. He says that the SOSA station operators report that men in black, within hours of the Scorpion sinking, pounded on their doors, flashed IDs indicating that they had security clearance, confiscated tapes and printouts within hours. Supposedly multiple sources said this. How is that organized to be able to do that worldwide? And the SOSA station operators, they have top secret compartmented clearances. They're the men in black. So who are these people? At any rate, of course, Ed Offley didn't use that term, but what he's describes a men in black conspiracy theory. That Offley says that a massive Navy search started on Friday before Scorpion failed to arrive on Monday. The Compass Islands deck logs were forged to show her import over the weekend. 3 sailors say that. Now, these 3 sailors, the ship's former CO said no. Of course, that didn't happen. He got in touch with one of the former sailors to say, how could you have said that? Why did you say that, sailor? Well, I just wanted to make sure that the ship got credit for what we did. And the sailor essentially admitted that he lied to Offley and exaggerated the Compass Islands participation. Now, the Compass Island, by Offley's conspiracy theory, said they found Scorpion on the bottom with sonar in June, and they covered it up. He cites 3 sailors that said this happened. When I look back, I see who the names of the sailors there. I look back when he identifies the sailors, and there are 2 boiler technicians and an electronics technician. None of the sailors he cited were submariners. The boiler technicians probably didn't pal around in sonar. The ET probably did not. But he, again, even if he did, he's not likely to have understood what the sonar we're talking about. He cites several sources saying that they, in sonar operator training and SOSA's operator training, said that they were in training programs, showed a tape, and were supposed to analyze the tape that was supposed to be the dogfight between Echo and the Scorpion. Now, other sources say, yeah, there was a training tape used. It was a hodgepodge where we married noise from an Echo to noise from Scorpion to noise of a torpedo in the water and explosion, and that was what they used. So it all kind of falls apart. In addition to trying to track down unnamed sources, it's hard to disprove. It's hard to prove a negative, but a lot of these things just don't hold together. And the fact that Offley separates the information about these 3 sailors' ratings and rates from the statement that they talked about what sonar did tells me he was enlisted in Vietnam. He understands rates and ratings. He understands boiler technicians can't talk about what goes on in sonar with any authority. This reading about all this got me some insight and wisdom into how difficult it is to challenge a conspiracy theory. Now, when you do an investigation of information, you take an unbiased investigation, you put together all of your data, you put together this package of this is the stuff, and you draw your theory, your findings of what happened through the best fit through all the data. But once a theory starts with the premise that there's an overarching powerful entity manipulating the evidence of testimony, a conspiracy, you can draw your theory through a series of outliers that support the theory and declare everything else to be part of the conspiracy. For example, we're supposed to believe that multiple people lied, including under oath to the Court of Inquiry, that legal records like the Compass Island deck logs are falsified. Offley takes credit for multiple sources saying the same thing, although they're a small subset of the voices that are saying something else. It sounds to me, understanding how militaries work and how the Navy works, that there's been this rumor mill alive in the Navy for 40 years by the time Alfley started to put his book together. And he tapped into these rumors from multiple directions, the same rumors from multiple directions, and called it confirmation. Anyway, I'm running late now. I'm sorry, but we're wrapping up here. In the aftermath of this, the Navy addressed potential problems with the Mark 37 torpedo. The Navy modified ventilation lineup procedures during the main storage battery charge on a nuclear submarine, and the Navy continued to backfit such modifications to all nuclear submarines. Still, officially, no definitive finding is the Navy's default position based on the Court of Inquiry, and that no one has been authorized to override what the Court of Inquiry has said. The information declassification on the 25th anniversary, the Court of Inquiry said no definitive explanation. It was clear that in '68 they were leaning toward the Mark 37 torpedo problems, probably based on Wesley Craven's heavily weighing their opinions, particularly the external explosion finding was taken as evidence they must have been a torpedo involved. Didn't satisfy their survivors who are looking for closure or quell the conspiracy theorists. So after 50 years, there's a strong movement to give the closure to the wives and children, surviving wives and their children. Is there a definitive determination really possible without a time machine to go back? On the one hand, remember the U.S. government, Department of Defense, and the Navy are responsible for providing a CACO team, a casualty team, to the families, a chaplain for emotional and spiritual support, and a commissioned officer to try and help them cut through red tape in order to access survivors' benefits. Maybe the military looking after its own, looking after its wives. Servicemen need to know that if something happens to them, their families will be looked after. Now, this is during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. 99 dead servicemen in Vietnam is probably a light week. It's not enormous that we've just lost 99 servicemen. Officially, the nation took casualties, and we did what was required to take care of the families. Servicemen were appreciated, but servicemen were expendable in the 1960s. Policymakers in that day and age had fought in World War II, and they were used to casualty lists in the thousands. All legal obligations were met on the one hand. On the other hand, the service's commitment to people, including the survivors, is there. And the Navy walk away from this saying, we did our bit and it's up to the wives to move on. Years ago, there was a Navy retirement pitch that went something like, Navy wife, it's the hardest job in the Navy. Well, all the services recognize that the greatest factor in a serviceman not re-enlisting after enlistment is up is his wife, or in this case, it could be his husband, saying, no way, you did your bit, it's time to leave that now. So the Navy has to recognize that appeasing the wives is necessary. So is more owed at this point to the Navy wives who lost their husbands on the Scorpion. Would we find this treatment acceptable today? So I'm well over time. I apologize for that. I'll certainly stay on for as long as necessary to answer any questions. Okay, I have a question from Mo Romaniak. I apologize. The problem has that one. Would have been normal sub-procedures to lock both the auto horizontal cruise control and the vertical control at the same time, or Skip control left in manual. We rarely put, at any speed, depth control in automatic. That's considered too important. We need to keep it in the hands of two trained enlisted men, helmsmen and stern planesmen, because the ability to recover at high speed, you're going to be very quickly. Imagine how you're going from your operating depth to crush depth is 700-foot displacement vertically. Imagine how quickly you can close 700 feet doing 24 knots. So we keep that up to human beings to operate that. We use auto course control a lot. I've seen auto depth control used, but not over 10 knots. So it would not be usual to go into auto depth control. If we did, it would have been interesting. What would have happened if everyone in the Scorpion, in fact, was killed by a battery explosion? The Scorpion would likely have kept running all the way up to Norfolk and run up onto Virginia Beach. That would have been exciting in the extreme. Okay, other questions? Okay. All right, I'm well over time. I appreciate your listening, and I thank you for your vote, for your enthusiastic response. And we'll be talking again later. Take care. Thank you. Bye.